We'll make. All right, all right. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our session for National Council of Black Studies, a session Title IX at 50, Examining Equity for Black Girls and Women in Sport. We are so happy to be here today. I am Dr. Akilah Carter-Francique. I am an executive director at San Jose State University of the Institute for the Study of Sport, Society, and Social Change. I also am an associate professor in the Department of African American Studies at San Jose State University. We're going to work and try to get this session started here, and we'll do some brief introductions of individuals as we come into the space. So let me just a quick second here. All right. Okay, so I think we're still waiting for one of our colleagues to come in. So what I'm going to do, we're going to take a quick moment before we do get started and go into introductions. So again, thank you everybody for being here on this Saturday, I believe, Saturday, February 26th. And so with that said, I'm going to go over to Dr. Courtney Flowers from Texas Southern University. She's an associate professor in sport management, to introduce herself.
Well, howdy, everybody from Texas. Glad that you guys are here joining us. My name is Courtney Flowers. I hail from Texas Southern University, where I teach sports studies for our graduate programs. I'm also a faculty affiliate with Dr. Carter-Francique at San Jose State University for the Institute. I also serve as an advisory board member for Name, Image, Likeness Third Party Facilitator, SPRI. My expertise is in Title IX gender equity. I typically speak from a sport law perspective, so I'm so excited that you guys are here with us this morning and ready to engage about Black women in sports. I'll pass it over to Dr. McDowell.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for attending our session. And so I'm Dr. Jacqueline McDowell. I'm an associate professor of sport management here at George Mason University. And I'm also the academic program coordinator for the kinesiology undergraduate program. And so I'm excited today. I'll talk to you a little bit about the experiences that Black women in sport have as far as athletic director and also in the coaching positions. Thank you.
Good afternoon or morning or evening, wherever you are. I guess between morning and afternoon. I am Dr. Jasmine Hamilton. I am also from Texas. Actually coming from live and direct from New Orleans, Louisiana at the moment. But I am also too at Prairie A&M University. I am an associate professor within the Health and Kinesiology Department. I teach undergraduate and graduate courses within kinesiology, more so on the pedagogy, physical education, exercise science. My area of expertise is now branched into assessment and accreditation within higher education, as my roles as assessment coordinator for the entire College of Education and also for the university.
Oops, got to unmute. Hello, I'm Dr. F. Michelle Richardson. I am a sport management professor at Coppin State University in the College of Business, where, but my emphasis is representation and the HBCU college experience. And so I'll be talking about HBCU's Title IX and how it coordinates with HBCUs.
Great. And we have another panelist that will be joining us shortly, Dr. Joyce Olushola-Ogunrinde from the University of Houston. She is an assistant professor in their Department of Health and Human Performance. So as she's navigating into this space, we're going to go ahead and get started. As I'm looking at our webinar functions, I just want to be able to communicate with the audience because I'm seeing there may be I want to make sure that you all have the opportunity to provide some questions should you want to definitely use the Q&A function and or the chat function as we go through this process. But we want to thank you for joining us again on this day to talk about Title IX at 50, particularly as it pertains to Black girls and women in our sporting spaces. So thank you very much. Okay. So I'm going to back up just a couple of slides real quick to get to some of a little bit of introduction for you all. And it's starting off with this commentary here, this notion of Ain't I a Woman? Black female athletes fight. As we go into this panel discussion, the goal that we have is to really highlight the work of Black female sports scholars. And so within this session, our goal is to illuminate the history and contemporary benefits and barriers of Title IX. Additionally, this session will celebrate 50 years of seeking racial and gender equity and equality in sports for Black girls and women. Our featured panelists, as you just met, each work and serve in multiple, and you'll hear more about them during their respective segments, but each work in multiple educative and leadership roles, not only in the sports space, but also in the wider society. So our focus for today is really to talk about how our work, how our efforts work to really sort of guide and foster the development of practical, theoretical, and educational next steps for inclusive practices of women and their sporting experiences in the discipline of African American, Africana, and Black studies. So, with that said, yes, Ain't I a Woman? That phenomenal words and terms used by our pioneers, this notion of Black females athletes fight. And so as we see here on this slide, Black female athletes fought for their communities with their athletic prowess and community activism. And this has gone on since the beginning of our opportunity and access to sport participation, as early as Ora Washington and as late and as recent as the work efforts of Naomi Osaka and Simone Biles. But despite their success, despite our success on the national and international stage, sexism and racism have both worked in concert to silence the work of these women, what they did, not only on the court, field, pool, rink, bobsled lane, but also off the field to advance the causes for Black people, Black women, and Black children. So as we get into this conversation, again, I want you to sit back, relax, learn a little bit about this space and perhaps find some of the intersections and possible ways that we can work together, network together to build bridges for our respective scholarship and respective journeys to support Black girls and women through their sport participation. So you've already heard from our speakers. And so one of the things that we wanted to do was definitely talk about this notion of Title IX. I'm going to bring Dr. Courtney Flowers up on stage real quick. I want her to just shine a light real quick on this Title IX, what the legislation is and what it says.
And so when we're looking at Title IX, we're exploring the idea of having a statute that brought together what we saw with race, civil rights, but also looking towards understanding that there has to be equity there. Now, within those 37 words that you see on your screen, we don't see college athletics, and we're going to dive deep into that today and kind of talk about why there's this link between college athletics and Title IX. But we're seeing a way for people to make sure that women are basically included. When we're looking at it, we're talking about the whole idea of participation when we're talking about sports. Are there opportunities for women through this law that basically applies to allow them to have a space in college athletics? And so as we look at the year 1972, we know it's around this time that we're seeing women be basically ostracized in some ways in regards to college athletics. But we're also seeing this law really be an advocate to make sure that women have a space in sports. Now, to broaden it out, when we look again at the 37 words, we're not seeing sports. And so we're seeing college athletics fall in under the umbrella of your institution. And so because the institution itself has to follow Title IX, we're seeing that apply to college athletics. But also because of the beautiful flashlight that is shined on college athletics, we're seeing Title IX be linked to sports because of displacement of sports like wrestling, displacement of men's sports. And with that notion, a lot of people feel in the debate that Title IX was a direct attack of men's sports. But again, when we get to the basis of it, there's two different ways to see it. It's not just an athletic law. And so Title IX applies to your science clubs, it's going to apply to your recreational clubs. It's basically saying that it's a protection to make sure that people are not discriminated based on sex. Now, later on in this discussion, we're going to apply race to that and talk a little bit about the intersectionalities. But just for a couple seconds, really reflect on that this is a law that is really making sure that any institution that receives federal financial aid assistance really make sure that everybody that is discriminated against has an opportunity to participate.
So to start us off, we've got a conversation on academic engagement. We're going to spend the next few moments really unpacking the various aspects of Title IX and ways in which Black girls and women have been affected. So first up, I'm talking about academic engagement, Dr. Jasmine Hamilton from Prairie View A&M University and Dr. Michelle Richardson from Coppin State University. If you want to take a moment, introduce yourselves a little bit more thoroughly, feel free.
Hello again. It's within this role to within academic and engagement. Before getting into that piece, really wear a lot of different hats within higher education environments, from actually as well as acting as assistant department head. I actually forgot that piece because of all the stuff that I actually do. But within that, with our department being kinesiology, we are very closely linked, as Dr. Flowers did discuss, with having athletics and college athletics. A number of our students are very much so involved in students or as student athletes. And so that draws a huge connection between what even I do down just on the class level and the things that I am able to discuss with my undergraduate students as well as my graduate students. And so we'll get into a little bit more of that piece of it too in a second. Dr. Flowers, I'm sorry, Dr. Richardson.
Hi, like I said, once again, I'm Dr. Michelle Richardson at Coppin State University. And what I'm talking about is a lot of things that I go over in my classes on a regular basis, but also just, I always look at representation and being a product of HBCU and teaching at HBCUs. I always find that HBCUs struggle with being recognized and having representation. And Title IX, and Title IX, where there are things that Title IX helped, Title IX has also hurt HBCUs or hurt women at HBCUs. And so I'm going to kind of go through that and talk about that briefly as well. Dr. Hamilton.
Yes. Next slide, please.
Next slide.
So as we need to go one back. As we're getting the slide back together, Dr. Flowers mentioned that looking at the tie between education and then collegiate sports, and how a lot of people just quickly identify Title IX as something strictly dealing with collegiate sports. But as we have kind of traditionally known, education has been seen as a vehicle for advancement. And so with those vehicles of advancement, those educational institutions have been that medium that we have are needed for the organization of sport or organized sport. And so that's where we see kind of that marriage of those two. And sometimes one is looked at as being more so prioritized than the other. And so that is a common conversation too as well. So I wanted to initially start off with looking at academic engagement by the numbers and just quantifying some of the information that we have. And so when you look at participation, actually I did want to start off looking at the participation of just Black women within higher educational systems and just look at those trends from around 1972, whenever Title IX started, until now. And showing those trends and just looking at the women who are in the higher education areas, who are also seeking advanced degrees as well. Bringing up the point of that is something that I really wanted to express to start to paint that picture. What is very interesting is that the data has not been available at all. And with that data not being currently available, what has popped up are a number of articles actually, and when I say articles, just different things on the internet too as well, not necessarily research articles, but basically saying that Black women are not the most educated group within the US and doing different things with numbers within their different articles to reverse that narrative, or just not to discuss or look at just the proportion of Black women, even though we may be in smaller numbers population wise, looking at the proportion of Black women who are or have sought degrees beyond high school. And so I thought that point was actually very interesting as we're focusing on Black women and just having some of those things that are out there that are trying to disrupt that narrative. As we look to what we have on the screen here with looking at female student athletes in the US by 2020 by ethnicity, it may be somewhat small, but that very first, very tall blue bar is white, and they are around 69%. And then that second highest blue bar we see there is with Black or African American at 9.2%. So that is the numbers for are the most current numbers that we have within 2020 looking at ethnicity. The second graph, since the other information was not necessarily there, was looking at graduate student rates. So within athletics, collegiate athletics, there's two main data points. One is APR that looks at their academic progress. And then the second major point is actually looking at the graduation success rate. And this is a chart that looks at a 20-year difference. And so if you look down at the bottom with Black women, as in the 16th with everyone else, there has been an increase with that graduation success rate. And then also too, looking at women within higher education, just how many women, not necessarily within college athletics, but looking at populations of women who are in faculty positions within higher education. And so we see too with the minority or underrepresented minority populations with Latinx being 5% of full-time faculty and 6%. And then the percentages change too as well when you begin to look at it by rank, how many assistant professors, associate professors, and then full professors too as well, which are all very small numbers or small percentages of proportions of Black women that we have in the US. Next slide, please. So as we look at these numbers and then look at kind of the stories that come behind the numbers, when we do have women within these environments and these areas, whether they are directly linked with collegiate athletics or not, still looking at kind of where we have come with Title IX, just simply even by participation. And as we look even just simply by participation, looking at women and the things that they encounter, whether they're at an HBCU or at a PWR, predominantly white institution, and looking at the things that the support systems, what are those factors that are there to help and assist or have helped some of these numbers increase. And so we look at things like sense of belonging, and we'll get more into this too a little bit more, but sense of belonging, community cultural wealth, things go into having rapport with faculty, and this is whether or not you were a college athlete or not. Resources that are available, sources for support, looking at some of those differences too with those different types of sources of report, whether it's informational and so on. And then also to having that sense or comfort and level of competence and self-efficacy too being developed within those environmental climates. Next slide.
Okay, so this is me. And I kind of wanted to start when we were talking about representation. And these are two women who are products of the HBCUs, and they came up during the time of the early ages and the early stages of Title IX. And when Title IX first came out, everybody was saying how this is going to be the game changer for Black women. But if you look at the statistics, actually, it's not. But I want to bring these women to light because in spite of these two women were trailblazing pioneers. And so first we have the late, great Barbara Jackett of Prairie View A&M. And I just want to give a brief, she is a product of Tuskegee Institute, now Tuskegee University, where she was a thrower on the track team under the great Nell Jackson. But her career just went further. She left there, she went to Prairie View A&M University, where she started the women's track team in 1965. She's been a member of USA Track and Field, where she was the coach of the United States Olympic team in 1992. She has just boatloads of accolades. She's in the International Women's Sports Hall of Fame. I want to make sure I'm getting all of the International Sports Hall of Fame, the United States Track Association Cross Country Hall of Fame. She's a 23-time SWAC Coach of the Year. She's, like I said, she started the PV women's track program in 1965. And so, like I said, she was doing it before and after Title IX. Then that brings me over to Coach Sonia Tyler, who I knew personally as a student at Howard University. Coach Tyler, her significance is she was the first to sue on the grounds of Title IX and win. She won $1.1 million at Howard University, from Howard University. Her case was about, Sheila, not being paid as much as the then men's basketball coach, Butch Beard, who was a former Hall of Famer. And I loved talking to Coach Tyler about this, where it was like, she was winning. She's the winningest coach in women. I think she's the winningest coach in MEAC, in women's basketball in MEAC history. She coached there for 21 years at Howard University, has a winning record. She was winning games, winning the conference when Mr. Beard was there, but they told her because he was a man and he had a family that he deserved to be paid more. And strangely enough, Coach Tyler winning her case was the precipice for Marianne Stanley winning her case later that year. Coach Tyler, her case was decided and she was awarded $1.1 million in a jury decision in June of 1993. Marianne Stanley, when she sued University of Southern California for the same reason, her case was won because Coach Sonia Tyler won her case in June. Stanley won her case in August of the same year. But people always tend to want to give credit to Marianne Stanley, but Coach Sonia Tyler, if Coach Tyler hadn't won her case, I'm not sure that Marianne Stanley would have won hers. There was really, because she was standing literally squarely on the shoulders of Sonia Tyler's win. And strangely enough, right now, just yesterday came over the news that Coach Audra Smith, the head women's basketball coach at South Carolina State, was fired a day after filing a Title IX lawsuit against the university. And Coach Smith, she basically was suing and trying to get the Freedom of Information Act to request information on the funding of her program and the fact that she was getting paid $30,000 less than the men's basketball coach at South Carolina State, and the fact that her program was getting less funding. Her team, the women's basketball team, getting less funding, and the men's basketball team having perks of like when a team came to play the men's basketball team, that they would change, the visiting team would change in the women's locker room. But when a team came to play South Carolina's women's team, they had to find another different locker room. They couldn't change in the men's locker room of South Carolina State. So these type of disparities, I mean, this just happened. Yet this just got announced. Yet she filed Thursday, she was fired on Friday. Next slide. Next, okay. So what you're looking at here is a picture of the new face of HBCU athletics. Once again, they said when Title IX came, this was going to be the game changer for Black women athletes. Well, what you have here are all the head volleyball coaches for the MEAC conference. So you have 5 white males and only 3 Black females for volleyball in the MEAC conference. And I'm not by any way saying that these men are not qualified. This is not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is because of Title IX, these men are able to come to HBCUs, which in the past would have never happened. This would have never happened, and get paid, and because these are Division I programs, be paid a competitive wage. Where they say, because this is happening across the SWAC, but you're never going to find this in the SEC, where you have, you'll always, SEC, all the volleyball coaches are white, whether they be female or male. This is historically Black conferences where Title IX is not even helping us get jobs in our own historically Black conferences. The other issue with this is because we have 5 white males who are head coaches, the rosters are now starting to reflect who's doing the recruiting. So you'll look at teams, and I'm not just saying, you'll look at teams, you have now more white players playing at HBCUs on these volleyball teams. They're recruiting a lot of Eastern Europeans. And like I said, at historically Black colleges and universities. And this is happening mostly in the Olympic sports. If you look at tennis teams, if you look at baseball, basically non-revenue generators, baseball, tennis, volleyball, some track and field. These sports across HBCUs, if you look in the SWAC as well as the CIAA, or just look at HBCUs, this is the change. I'm not saying that these people are not qualified. What I'm saying is Title IX has made it so that they can now come out of the white conferences in and be successful in historically Black conferences. And so this is a lack, this is still making a lack of representation for Black women in collegiate athletics. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we're going to move and talk about interscholastic and college sport with Dr. Courtney Flowers from Texas Southern University.
Hi, everybody. I'm going to piggyback a little bit of where Dr. Richardson left, so I'll take the next slide. In the graphic that we just saw, it's really kind of difficult to kind of put forth or really understand how that happens. But when you look at Title IX in its real in the border of it and try to figure out what the law is saying, it's a single access law that focuses solely on sex. And so in that same vein, it doesn't look at race. And so we see a lot of displacement in regards of discrimination on race because Title IX is only focused on sex. And so in that same vein, we can easily say, and it's not debatable, that Title IX has helped Black women in sports. We have seen a huge percentage of increased enrollment in high school and in college sports of Black women and women of color. There's no debate on that. However, in this presentation, we're also trying to highlight that as quickly as we've seen some achievements and we can say we've had some tremendous wins, we also have some shortfalls and we still have a ways to go as Title IX is looking to turn 50 coming up in June. One of the things that we look at, especially when we're talking specifically about Black women in sport, is we can think about certain sports and we can easily say that we don't see that representation. We don't see the representation of women of color in rowing and in soccer, in lacrosse, in equestrian, even in golf. We don't see a lot of that representation in what we know as those club sports or those Olympic sports. I thought it was really cool to use this quote. North Carolina A&T 2016 had a motto that really kind of spoke to that. And it says, Black girls do swim, and that's a picture of them. That's really trying to focus on getting over one of those walls. There is a direct link between people perceiving Black people as not being aquatic at all. Representation, not just on participation, but also in understanding the nuances of how to swim. Racism, even with buoyancy, saying that Black people sink, so we can go on and that could be a whole nother session. But I felt like their team model really kind of tackled some of that and really showed that, yes, Black people do swim. Black people do go to the Olympics. We saw that too. But Black people do coach in swimming and are interested in water sports, even though we don't see that representation a lot. We could go to the next slide. Now, again, as I said, that single access law is really what we're going to focus on in the next couple slides. It's because Title IX is focused on sex discrimination that we don't see that same legal protection in race. And it's for that reason that we're seeing women of color follow under the radar. And it's for that reason that we're able to say, specifically more on the college side versus high school side, that white women benefit more from Title IX in comparison to Black women. When we're looking at gender equity and we're sitting in the position of college athletics, there's a sole focus to raise participation opportunities for women. And unfortunately, a lot of those participation opportunities that we're seeing that are emerging are more your club sports. Things like I said before, your lacrosse. We're seeing a lot now with water sports coming forth. Pretty much a lot of those sports that we're seeing a lot of college athletic programs and high school athletic programs push forward to meet gender equity requirements in Title IX are those sports that typically we don't see women of color and Black women in. We could go to the next slide. This is a really cool quote. The National Women's Law Center basically said, providing girls of color that equal opportunity is basically denying them health, academics, economic benefits that basically make them fruitful and push them forward later on in their careers. Now, when we're looking at intercollegiate athletics, in 2015, we also saw an awesome report that came out that talked about Black girls. More of a percentage of them were kicked out versus Black males, Black boys in high school. And because of this, we saw that there was less likely a transition if you're kicked out of high school to continue on to go to college and then continue on even to develop your career. Now, why is that important and why are we making that intersection of sport? We're seeing that sport shakes hands directly with health benefits. There's research that states that our student athletes, students that start sports earlier, are more apt to be a little bit more cognizant of their food, their nutrition. Obviously, exercise is going to be huge with them because of the team participation, but it goes further. When we're talking about mental health, there's also that socialization and being able to understand how to get over crucial things like the social barriers that we face in high school, that those students that are competing in high school sports at an earlier age are able to basically mentally understand because of that teen interaction. Now, we see this a lot when we're talking about the high school level. And it's in that high school level that we're seeing that if we focus on them and looking at those opportunities, it's easier for us to kind of really see what's going to happen on the college level and maybe even on the Olympic level, and even be a lens to see what's happening on the professional level for women in sports. So let's pick on my sport, golf. I am a former high school and college golfer. And in that same vein, what we're seeing right now is that there is less than 10 women that have achieved LPGA Tour Card status. And so in that same example, let's go back and let's try to trace and see how that intersects to Title IX. Well, research is saying right now that there is an extreme lack of women of color and of Black women specifically that are playing golf right now on the youth level. Now, we saw an increase when we had Tiger Woods play, and through Tiger, we saw a lot of people, especially minorities, race to the golf courses and pick up a club. But we also know that there are economic barriers. And so you're less likely to play a sport that could be more expensive if your family does not have the means to do it. More importantly, you're less likely to do it if you haven't been socialized around a golf course, or also if you feel uncomfortable because you don't know anybody who plays that sport. Things like, what do I wear? How do I play golf? Are people going to laugh at me because I have no idea where to start on the golf course? All goes into play when we're looking at this. Next slide. Some more barriers that we're seeing, and I thought this one was extremely, extremely important, is that when we're looking at girls of color, we're seeing their percentages totally outweigh when we're talking about the whole intersectionality of understanding what school we're selecting to send our kids to, or the school system itself. And so in this quote, it's basically saying that African-American girls, girls of color, Black girls that are attending Black schools have least opportunities to play at these schools. And some of the times what we're hearing when we're looking in comparison of the Black girls at minority schools versus Black girls at white schools, it goes into play, and we can easily correlate that conversation to HBCUs and PWIs, which are predominantly white institutions as well. Now, piggybacking on what Dr. Richardson says, it kind of really shakes hands with that notion, and it kind of explains even more why we're seeing teams at HBCUs now recruiting students that are non-minorities, non-people of color, and why those percentages are increasing even more. We could go to the last slide, I believe. There we go. That's Dr. Okay, so that's it for me. I apologize, but thank you, everybody. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Flowers. That's a great segue into my conversation and looking at health and wellness, because in the things that you discussed, right, we know that the recommendations for all individuals, at least in the US, is to get at least 150 minutes of exercise a week. And what we don't talk about is what goes into why people are not getting that amount of exercise. Greetings, my name is Joyce Ogunrinde Olushola, and I am greeting you from Houston, Texas, particularly from the University of Houston. And just, you're gonna hear a theme along all of the presentations when we talk about this intersectionality, because we often see how recommendations for health, for participation, for management, marketing, career development are made based on these single access approaches, right? Particularly when we talk about Title IX. And I just want to echo what Dr. Courtney Flowers stated, in that Title IX did, and as well as Dr. Richardson, that Title IX did great things for opening door for women, but what it failed to address were the cultural and structural factors that kept Black women specifically from obtaining levels of success in sport participation and administration. And what we see now, as Dr. Flowers alluded to, is the health effects, right? And so we can go to the next slide. We all know that physical activity is a protective health factor. But what happens when we don't get that physical activity, right? And just to provide a graphic to what Dr. Flowers already alluded to, we want people to be physically active, but we're not providing them the opportunities to do so. Moreover, what we're doing, particularly in the case of Black people and Black women, we are now suggesting that their lack of physical activity is innate to who they are, as opposed to a structural inequality that they're facing. And so it's very important that we bring out these numbers and these graphics to show that, one, the opportunities participate in physical activity are not there for our Black girls as they are for other demographic groups. And then moreover, taking an emic approach to looking at Black girls and Black women's sport participation, from what we've seen with in the previous presentations, Black women are out there participating in being sport administrators. They want and desire these positions. From what we know in Kennedy 1995, athletic ability is the second most valued trait amongst African-American girls, and it's only second to academic ability. And we know what they're saying about Black girls in academics. It's the same parallel fight that we have when it comes to athletic ability, that girls don't want to participate, and that's why they are not. Whereas what we see here is that it's a structural issue, and what Dr. Flowers just alluded to, it's a cultural one, because now even when we do provide them the opportunities, do we make them feel physically and psychologically safe to participate in sport? So while Title IX has increased the opportunities for our girls to participate in sport and be sport administrators, it did not provide the direction or support in redressing the cultural and structural barriers that we face in order to do so. Next slide. So looking at what happens, right, when we allow girls to participate in sport, but we don't accommodate their existence, right? Two very prominent examples of that are Naomi Osaka and Simone Biles. And here are women who are doing it at the international level. They have what it takes physically to compete, as their records show, yet they're struggling mentally, and not because of anything innate to them, but because of what is going on structurally in sport, right? So one of the myths in sport is that sport is inherently good. And so therefore any deficits that we see in individuals who play sport is that it's innate to that individual. But what these young ladies, as well as many unheard and many silenced Black female athletes have been stating, is that the culture of sport is not conducive to the being of a Black woman. And so what we have to realize is that when we allow individuals to participate in sport, we have to make space for who they are as people before we can promote them as athletes. And so what they show us, one, again, is that Black women do desire to participate in sport and can do so at the highest levels. Yet we need to create sport environments that can grow into their identities and their motivations for participation. So the work of Bruning and Carter-Francique, as well as many scholars who are here with us today, have shown us that when Black women participate in sport and when they are selected as administrators and coaches, they often face discrimination based on their race and the intersection of their race and gender. And because of what we saw earlier, right, when we look at the changing demographics of administrators and coaches, that can lead to isolation physically and socially, as well as being silent, right, and allowing the input of Black women and girls to be heard in structuring their sport participation and career development opportunities. Next slide. So delving into social health, Coaching While Black was a round table with very prominent Black female athletes, and they talked about these issues, right? That what it means for them to be a Black female coach means being a leader for other Black coaches as well as Black girls, and encouraging their participation. But that comes with a fight, not only for their position, but also for their mental health and their social health. And so while Title IX provided these opportunities for women to participate, as said before, it did have unintended consequences for these coaches, right? Because now the gates are open, and not only are Black women applying for these positions, particularly like at HBCUs, we now see that white women and white men are doing so. And because of the economic advantages and structural advantages that these other groups had over Black women specifically, they're able to get these opportunities more so than Black females. And again, not because of a lack of quality, but just recognizing the structural inequalities that have allowed white men and white women to be in a place to take advantage of the opportunities provided by Title IX. And so, as stated before in Dr. Flowers and Dr. Hamilton's presentation, We do not deny the benefits of Title IX opening the doors and providing opportunities and resources to Black women and to be coaches, participants, and administrators. Yet what we're saying is that if we're going to sustain those efforts, more needs to be done to address the cultural and structural factors that are limiting their participation and their success in these positions. Next slide. So the implications that I want to suggest from what we've heard is that we need to center the lived experiences of Black women who are participants, athletes, coaches, and administrators in understanding their sport participation so that we can change the narrative, not only about Black women's health, Black girls' health, but also about how we desire and to participate in sport successfully, right? And so one is dismantling this notion that sport is inherently good and Black girls and Black women are inherently deviant, because what we can see from the presentations before me, Black women are doing it and they're doing it well. They're not only leading on the court and on the field, they're also leading in the community, which we'll hear about more in Dr. Carter-Francique's presentation about their, and Dr. McDowell's presentation about their leadership and their community activism. So really, if we want to change and improve the way that Black women participate in sport and increase the positive health outcomes they gain from sport participation, we need to recognize the meanings and motivation behind their sport participation and leverage that to create environments that are conducive to their well-being, mentally as well as physically. So in addition to that, as it's been stated before, we also need to do so, we need input from Black women, and we need more Black women in leadership roles to provide that input in structuring sport in a way that's beneficial, not only to Black women, but the communities in which they serve and represent. Thank you. And I now pass it to Dr. McDowell, who will tell us more about our Black women in leadership.
Thank you. Wonderful information. And I just want to kind of reiterate something that was said, was that Title IX is great, as you've heard from the other panelists, but when you have a single access law, that basically means if you're not looking at race, if you're only focusing on gender, you're definitely going to see the experiences of Black women as athletes, Black women in leadership positions, their experiences not getting addressed and not being thoroughly represented in these areas. And so that's what I will share a little bit today about the leadership experience. So if we can look at that next slide. So it's been mentioned that for participation, we definitely saw an increase when it came to participation of women inside high school athletics, also when we're looking at college athletics. But as Dr. Ogunrinde, Dr. Olushola, I'll use that one, sorry, as she mentioned, the law did not address our cultural and some of these structural barriers that women were dealing with and our Black women were dealing with. But also when we start looking at the leadership experiences, what we saw is white men actually benefited more when it came to leadership positions. And so when you look at the history, the takeover of women's leadership in women's athletics, it's pretty much marked symbolically by Title IX. And so originally the NCAA did not deal with women's athletics. The NAIA did. They also focused on HBCUs. And so the NCAA, the leadership, they had actually talked about it, but it wasn't until Title IX when they actually decided to make that leap. And so in December of 1980, that's when, and the leadership was with Walter Byers, that's when there was actually a vote that the NCAA would start sponsoring championships in women's athletics. And then the very next year, so understand, as you see on here, the Association for Intercollegiate Athletics for Women, the AIAW, that was the governing association for women's athletics. But after that vote happened in December 1980, if you notice, it ceased the operation and control of women's sports in 1981. Just 1 year later, the AIAW did not have control over women's athletics. You also saw a situation where originally 90% of the head coaching positions on women's teams, it was women in those positions. But now that the gates have been opened, now that scholarships are being offered, now that there's more money for women sports, because before the women were not getting paid to do this. Now you started to see men starting to come in and starting to coach on the women's teams. And that's why I made that comment that when we're looking at Title IX from that leadership perspective, a lot of white men and also Black men benefited from this law, and it lowered the representation of women in coaching and athletic leadership positions. If you look at the stat that I have shared, now we're looking between 40 to 45%. Of course, it fluctuates, through the years, but less than 50% of your women's teams are actually being coached by women. Now, our session is focusing on Black women, but if you notice, I can only give you the general numbers. And so one of the projects that I'm actually working on, the Black Women in Sport Foundation database project, we are actually looking to disaggregate the NAIA and the NCAA data. We are actually started looking at that. We're going to start with 2021 because it's important for us to know how many Black women, if we're saying 90%, what percent of that 90% were actually Black women in these positions? And we want to trace that throughout the years. We're also looking in our database to have their names, going along with this whole notion of say her name. We do not want these women to only be represented by a number. We want to actually have our database include their name. Next slide, please. So here's what we did get from the NCAA. When it comes to directors of athletics, you're looking at 32 women. That's basically 3% out of 1,106 directors of athletics. And understand, guys, that's for Division I, Division II, Division III, and it includes HBCUs. You're only looking at 32 women who are athletic directors. When it comes to head coaches of men's sports, so over the years, it's about 2 to 4% of women who will actually coach men's sports, mainly in some of your individual sports like tennis or swimming. But when it comes to white women, they represent more of that 4%. Black women only represent about 1%. So 67 Black women will actually coach on the men's side. And then when we're looking at head coaches of women's sports, 464. So guys, only 4% of your women's sports are being coached by a Black female. So it definitely shows you with Title IX, with what we're seeing in leadership, we're not getting good representation, especially when you compare our numbers as student athletes. We are not getting good representation from Black women in these leadership positions. I highlighted Dr. Carla Williams, and as you can notice, she was hired in 2017. She was the first African-American woman to be in a Power 5 institution. And so she was at the University of Virginia, 2017, first African-American woman. So that shows you that that struggle is still there. Next slide, please. When they get into these roles, some of the research that a lot of the panelists here have conducted, it showed you that even when they get to these positions, they're still dealing with many challenges, the same ones that were highlighted before that your student athletes are dealing with occupational stereotyping, gender role conflict. Should you be here? Some of the women that I end up interviewing and Dr. Carter-Francique that we talked to, they talked about how people still perceive them to be the secretaries. And here they are as the athletic directors. But that's when people saw them, they felt that, okay, this must be the secretary. Dealing with a lot of the racial and gender stereotypes and the stereotype threats. So some of the women actually talked about how they silence their voices because they don't want to be perceived as the angry Black woman. So you get to this point where you're finally in this leadership position, but you're still feeling silenced. Career constraints and obstacles. This was mentioned before, where a lot of these women felt like they were not being provided the same opportunities that other women and men were being provided to succeed inside their roles. They were criticized more, they were scrutinized. I remember some of the women I talked to, they made that comment that, well, if a white man would have said exactly what I said, and one of them said, and one of them did, it was not scrutinized. But when I said it, everyone decided to scrutinize it and criticize the comment. So the women had that extra criticism. And then we also found in our research that identity conflict and negotiation. A lot of you guys might have heard of shifting or covering. So a lot of the women that are in these leadership roles felt like they could not truly be themselves. And I put that quote from Alice Eagley down there where it said, it would be bad advice to exhort women and other outsiders to merely be themselves and express their heartfelt values. And what they were getting at is, a lot of times in leadership positions, you want to tell people just be yourself. But what we have found in our research, that a lot of times when Black women are truly being themselves, which is the best thing to be, it's not being perceived in a positive manner from other individuals. Okay, next slide, please. And so I had mentioned that I'm actually now working on a Black Women in Sport Foundation database project where we're looking to highlight the different Black women in sport and athletic director positions and also in leadership positions. And so I am currently on the board for the Black Women in Sport Foundation, and we're celebrating 50 years for Title IX, but we're also celebrating 30 years for the Black Women in Sport Foundation. And so you had 4 amazing women, as you can see on the screen. You had Tina Sloan Green, Dr. Alpha Alexander, Dr. Nikki Frank, and Dr. Linda Green. They were all at Temple University in different capacities, and they start talking about how they're not seeing great representation of Black women in non-traditional sports. This was mentioned before about Black women not being into swimming and rowing. So they started noticing that, and that's actually how they started the foundation. They wanted to do something to increase that. And so if you can play the video, I would like you guys to hear from Dr. Tina Sloan Green in her words about the foundation.
My name is Tina Sloan Green, and presently I'm the co-founder and president of the Black Women in Sport Foundation. The mission is to increase opportunities for African American girls in all aspects of sport, from the playing field to the boardroom. We've got to start early, and that's what the Black Women in Sport Foundation is, an intergenerational approach. Exposure, opportunity is very important. I would not be in my position had I not played field hockey, had not played lacrosse.
Thank you. And so, although as you heard, our focus is on Black women. So we're looking at Black women, Black girls, but the services that we provide, which is free sport programming, we provide that to any boys and girls who have a need. That helps address some of those structural barriers that individuals face when it comes to participating in sport. And so we definitely offer that free sport programming. Right now, we're mainly in Philadelphia, but we're definitely looking at branching to different areas of the United States. And so thank you guys.
Wow, I have to follow that. Thank you, Dr. McDowell, for that great information. It rolls right into this notion of activism and education. So again, I am Akilah Carter-Francique. I serve as the Executive Director for the Institute for the Study of Sports, Society, and Social Change at San Jose State University. And I'm also an Associate Professor in the Department of African American Studies. I think what we've heard today are those words: intersectionality, sight a Black woman. We do have the ability to coach, to lead, to play in more sports than track and field and basketball. And we have to be able to sort of understand that. And I think what many of my colleagues, these amazing women here have spoke about is, even with the notion of Title IX, is that there is still desperate need to advocate and to serve as activists in our respective spaces and places. So my colleagues here today all come from different fields, and we all work in different fields. But I think one of the things that we have to understand, particularly as it pertains to this conference, as it pertains to this moment in time in our modern day civil rights movement with Black Lives Matter, is that there's still work to be done. And there's still efforts that need to move forward. And women are doing that work, as cited here by Dr. McDowell, and highlighting the efforts of the Black Women's Sports Foundation and Tina Sloan Green, Alpha Alexander, Nikki Frank, and Linda Green, as the work of Sanya Tyler, as Dr. Richardson pointed out. And so I wanted to bring forth this notion of activism and advocacy are part of our backbone, if you will, when we talk about Black women in our communities. Again, that was reiterated with Dr. McDowell. And so I wanted to share a little bit of that notion that work still needs to be done, but how do we create these spaces and places for girls and women to begin to move forward? As I share here, I have a recent chapter that came out in a book regarding Muhammad Ali, and this notion of Africana memory that was co-edited by James Conyers and colleagues. And so in that book, I wanted to highlight the activist efforts of Black women in sport, but definitely to instill that the work of these Black women comes from the larger Black collective that's been reiterated and reaffirmed in this space here today and even throughout time. And so as we see here, Black girls and Black women are instilled at a young age to be activists. We're socialized in that space to resist. We have lived experiences. We see the barriers. We see these moments where we are treated differently, as Dr. O2, as I call her, suggests when we talk about sort of the cultural dynamics of how we are perceived in these respective spaces and places. So there's an awareness that's built. There's a consciousness of marginalization that's taking place, and a reflective experience of these interlocking oppressions also happening during this time frame. And so with that said, one of the things that I pointed out in this chapter, as we talk about Black women in these spaces, particularly in this notion of Title IX, is that yes, we were socialized to resist, which sort of reaffirms this notion of the importance of the Black women's collective and our mothers and grandmothers giving us the strength to push forward and be that representation. We have this consciousness to resist by the books that we read, by the actions that we see take place of our mothers navigating and having these extenuating circumstances when we talk about journeys. As I think about Carla Williams and her journey to be an AD, literally was a 20-year interview as compared to some white men that may be 4 or 5 years in a space and then they're promoted or hired into these spaces as athletic directors. And there's definitely this notion of this resist to self-define and self-valuate. And these are these notions of Black feminist thought, the work of Patricia Hill Collins, that say that we need to name who we are for ourselves. We need to value who we are for ourselves and come in our fullness to these spaces and places. We know it's been a difficult journey, but I think as Dr. McDowell stated, we need to be our authentic selves in these spaces to be happy, to be healthy, and to move forward. So Black women's sport activism is also steeped in these same notions of group survival, of institutional transformation. And so as I speak here and share here, we as Black women, as a part of the greater Black women collective, we live, we work, and we participate in institutions, as was noted at the beginning of this presentation, that were not created for us to thrive. Okay. And so this notion of activist mothering comes forth, this Black woman's tradition, as we see these many women here, as we talk about this notion of Ain't I a Woman, of Harriet Tubman, of Sojourner Truth, of Coretta Scott King, of bringing it to the notions of Fannie Lou Hamer, of Ella Baker, but even our modern day individuals that are doing some great work, of a Michelle Obama, if you will, our vice president at this moment. You know, we have this representation there, and we come from all walks and spaces and places, just as our panelists are. Yes, we're academics in diverse fields, but this concept of activist mothering is that extension of community other mothering and is rooted in this notion of political activism. And as we see in this moment, talking about Title IX turning 50, there is much work to be done. I have to point out that my dear colleague, Dr. Courtney Flowers, is at the fore of many of these conversations, as she's currently a part of writing the 50-year history on Title IX at 50 with the Women's Sports Foundation. Dr. Jacqueline McDowell, again, is on the cusp with the Black Women's Sports Foundation doing this work. And we are in the trenches moving this effort forward. And as we talk about this notion of activist mothering in sport, we want to understand, as Naples says here, is that it provides a new conception of the interacting nature of labor, of politics, and mothering, three aspects of social life usually analyzed separately from the point of view of women whose mother work has often been ignored or pathologized. Naples talks about this notion of activist mothering as it reflects the power of knowledge generated from self-defined, subjugated standpoints to decenter these dominant frameworks. We have to know ourselves for ourselves. We have to center us in these conversations and utilize the various platforms that we've had from which we can engage in these social justice and social action efforts, such as providing access and opportunity to girls and women, yes, even still today, in our sporting spaces, as participants, as leaders, as coaches, as scholars. And some of those women are doing that. But we come from, again, our own sort of activist history. So one of the things that I point out in this book chapter are this notion of our Black sportswomen activists, our mothers, that of Wilma Rudolph, and her efforts to say, yes, while I've won these 3 gold medals at the 1960 Olympics, we also have to understand that when she came back to Clarksville, Tennessee, she said, hey, they want to have a celebration for me, but it's still going to be segregated. I'm not having it. And so again, using her platform to fight for change. Wyoming Attias, 2-time gold medalist, back-to-back gold medalists in the Olympics from 1964 to 1968. And her efforts, when we talk about standing up and speaking up for social justice, were even often overshadowed at that 68 Olympics because of, yes, I'm here at San Jose State, the efforts of Smith and Carlos in the Olympic Project for Human Rights, but she also advocated for change. Erosina Robinson, Effa Manley, when we talk about the Negro baseball leagues and her leadership and ownership efforts, and even the Tennessee Tiger Bells through the coaching and leadership of Ed Temple, but through that dynasty of about 40 years, bringing in multiple gold medals and Olympic medals and performing on that global stage. If we move forward and think about even some of the daughters of this Title IX, right, and post-Title IX, those sportswomen, Wendy Hilliard, rhythmic gymnast, Sanya Tyler, as was spoken of earlier with Dr. Richardson, Tina Sloan Green, mentioned with the Black Women's Sports Foundation, Jackie Joyner-Kersee, an icon, one of my heroes, as I was a track and field athlete as well, doing great work with her Jackie Joyner-Kersee Foundation, providing, again, as Dr. McDowell said, access and opportunity for all boys and girls to be able to participate in sport and have programs that speak to their cultural selves and honor who they are. Flora Jean Flo Hyman, for which National Girls and Women in Sports Day, which had its 36th celebration this year on February 2nd, celebrate her, again, as a volleyball player and using her platform to promote social change and efforts for access for girls and women in sport. And even our granddaughters, as we speak today. And some of these names you may be a little bit more familiar with. Ariana Smith, who was a Knox College student that stood up and spoke out with the death and murder of Michael Brown. Brittany Griner, speaking on LGBTQ+ issues. Ibtihaj Muhammad, Olympic fencer, using her platform to speak about Muslim women and the religious aspects of access and opportunity. Gwendolyn Gwen Berry, using her platform to speak up and speak out against overt racism and discrimination still happening in this country, but using her platform to speak on those things and working with a group called Color of Change to amplify those efforts. And hopefully we all know and realize the work and efforts of the Women's National Basketball Association, in particular the Atlanta Dream, to one, oust a coach, but as well as promote those voting rights and change sort of the nature of our political landscape in their efforts when we talk about this last election. So these are just a few of the women that I wanted to share with you. They're all working towards those particular efforts. But I think as we share here today, it is that opportunity that this panel hopefully has demonstrated ways in which Title IX at 50, there's still much work to be done. whether it be from an academic engagement perspective, an interscholastic and collegiate sport participation perspective, health and wellness, leadership experiences, and of course, advocacy and activism. So at this time, we're getting close to our end. So I have just a couple of questions in this segment. I'm going to drop our screen and talk about what are some ways that we can build bridges and what are some calls to actions that we need to know about. So I'm going to take a brief moment. I'm going to stop share and come to our platform of our panelists and say, hello, thank you for being here again, each and every one of you. So, I want to throw out this question. I've got a lot of questions. We have a whole nother panel, and honestly, you guys can see us at, we're going to be at North American Society for the Sociology of Sport Conference in Montreal, Canada, April, what are we, 20th or so?
23rd.
Yes, to join us. I served as the organization's first African-American female president, yes, 2019, to add to that list, Dr. McDowell. And Dr. Michelle Richardson will be coming in as the next president in our next cycle. So congratulations to you. So with that said, I'm going to keep it simple in our last few minutes here of what are the next steps that we need to take when we talk about efforts for Black girls and women's access to sport participation, in particular, and understanding Title IX, and in reference to this great organization here with the National Council of Black Studies and African American Studies, Africana Studies, Black Studies, scholars, and programs. I know it's a robust question, but I just want us to give some calls to action for our attendees here and those that may be watching this later. So I'm going to start with Dr. Hamilton. What are our next steps? What are calls to action from your perspective and your wonderfulness?
I'm trying to get to my notes real quick. From an academic engagement standpoint, I think one thing is a lot that we are actually doing now, and I know a lot of people within these spaces, within this conference and so on, is mentoring students. But even if it's not as deep as a relationship, as a mentorship, one thing that all the students I come in contact with, I let them know, like, you are continuing that history now. Like, you are the next person that's coming up. Whether you end up in a larger platform or not, what you're currently doing in the area that you want to go into is contributing to that narrative. And so to not continue to be our own worst enemy. And I tell this to all our students, whether male, female, white, Black, whatever, that you all can stop these negative things from happening and being more intentional and strategic about the things you do and how you do them. And I'll stop right there to let everybody else go into.
Wonderful. Dr. Richardson, what are next steps? What are our calls to actions, our call-ins, hashtag call-in, hashtag cite a sister? What are our next steps?
Hashtag be an ally. We've talked about, that right now, basically white men are benefiting the most from Title IX, then white women, then black males, then Black females. I'm asking you to be an ally for the white men, for the men in charge, for the women in charge who are not people of color. You have to be an ally. You have to get outside of your comfort zone. You and possibly mentor a Black female who is someone who is different from you. Because if you can look at this panel, we're all kinds of different Black women. I know somebody said, Dr. McDowell talked about the angry Black woman. I have been labeled that. Me, on the other hand, I kind of embrace it, but in a different way, because, and it's because if you look at, like I said, I wear my hair barbered as opposed to wearing a length of a hair. And so some type of preconceived notion comes in. So I actually need an ally to say, no, I need an ally to say, please get past your idea of what she's visually, and understand that she brings a knowledge, she brings a dearth of knowledge that we need. We need allies who see past our stereotypes. So I would say hashtag be an ally to a woman of color. It is a shame that after 50 years of Title IX and generations of doing this work, that Black women and women of color still need white males to walk them through the door. But unfortunately, this is the world that we live in. So what I'm going to say, hashtag be an ally. That's what I've got to say.
Thank you much, Dr. Richardson. again, such great information. We've just briefly dropped a Adobe Spark page that has all of our information, but even information that we shared today to serve as resources. So we look forward and hope that you can connect. I want to keep moving in our conversation again. Final words, next calls to action. I want to go to Dr. Flowers. What are our next steps? What do we need to think about specifically, again, in this space of Title IX, girls and women's access and opportunities and experiences in sport?
I have two. First, ask a question. Second, get out and play. I think all too often we know something's wrong. We know there's no representation, but we don't ask the question, why? Why are there no Black women? Why are there no Black girls playing on these teams? And I think it's so important that we ask those questions, really get out of our space of comfort and say, why aren't there representation here? I think that can come from people of color and non-people of color as well. You know, I think we really have to start bringing that to people's attention. Secondly, for mental health, get out and play. You'll be so shocked how many kids, especially because of COVID, how many parents are just have to stay inside. I think if we push to increase participation in sports, maybe that we didn't play. What's wrong with looking at lacrosse? What's wrong with looking at some of those water sports and introducing our kids, our friends to different things? Really just trying to, again, get outside of our comfort zone, but more importantly, just get out and play.
Thank you so much. Joyce, Olushola-Ogunrinde, O2, talk to us a little bit. Again, what are next steps? What are those calls to action? Thinking in that space of, as Dr. Flowers mentioned, sort of the health and wellness spaces.
Right, I think that to keep it simple, ask a Black girl what she wants and listen. I think what we're missing is the input of those who we're trying to advocate for and how they want to participate in sport, either as athletes or administrators and coaches. And we need to hear from those individuals, the Black women you see here, the Black women that came before us, and the Black girls who are coming after us. When they tell you their experience, listen, and listen with the critical ear to understand that our experiences are shaped by the structures as well as the cultures around us. And so in thinking about next steps, right, is listening to Black girls and critically analyzing their experiences to debunk the stereotypes about why and how we participate in sport and reimagine, like Dr. Flowers just said, reimagine what it would look like if Black girls and Black women could play at their fullest potential and not based on the stereotypes about their race and gender. So you hear talk to Black girls and women and listen with a critical ear. And two, I just want to reiterate to go out there and play. Each one of us being here is an example, has an opportunity to lead by example. Our physical health is important. We cannot do this work mentally, socially, if we are not here physically. So take care of yourselves and use that as use your own personal health as a platform to encourage the health of Black women and girls.
Thank you so much. I just came from sponsoring and supporting a 5K this morning, which my daughter ran and did awesome. My son participated. But yes, staying engaged, let her play, keep playing. Dr. McDowell, in this role of Title IX and thinking of leadership efforts, what does that mean for us as we talk about next steps, our calls to action, not only for Title IX, girls and women in sport, but in particular, when we talk about our Black studies programs and being able to sort of build those bridges, any offerings?
Yes, but I want to also go with Dr. Flowers made that comment to ask that question, why are they not represented? Why are they not playing on these teams? And so for our call to action, I think it's important to make sure we don't just ask that question in relation to varsity sports, because that is what is happening right now. If we are really trying to move forward and look at the effect that Title IX has had, we definitely need to start looking at your intramural sports, your club sports, take a better look at what's going on at your high school sports, but also, and this was kind of mentioned with everyone, look to see what is happening at that youth level when it comes to the participation of Black girls. Are they only participating in basketball or track? Are we seeing them in some of the non-traditional sports, which is, as I mentioned, the whole focus of the Black Women in Sport Foundation? So to me, that's definitely some of the next steps that we can take. And it does not just have to be sport management professors, sports sociologists, professors. As we're looking at these attendees, these are issues that we can look at from a Black studies perspective, because sport intersects with everyone's life. So this is not just a sport issue, it is a life issue when it comes to the representation. It is a life issue when we're looking at these leadership positions and we don't see a lot of women looking like us in these positions. If I can't see you, I can't be you. That's what a lot of women feel. If they cannot see you, then they don't have those aspirations. And so those are the studies that I think people really need to look at, is what's going on at that youth level. And then when we're talking about leadership, let's get some more individuals who are focusing on Black studies to start looking at what's happening with Black women in these leadership positions and what can we do to help elevate them, to help encourage more women to be in these positions.
I thank you so much for that. I mean, each and every one of you, I mean, y'all my sister docs. And that's really what we call ourselves. We found each other at various time periods, but came together for the scholarship and the love we have for Black women and ourselves and sport. And so that's what we wanted to share with this in this space today, is that, you know, my sort of takeaway is that we need to use our platforms. From that activist perspective, we all have an opportunity to plant a seed into a young girl, into their parents, to say, hey, why don't you try this? Why don't we get involved in this? Why don't we go participate in this run? Today, we ran, we walked, we rolled, and we strolled for Black Health and Wellness for Black History Month. My daughter was a part of that. They got to learn about the mission, or the theme, if you will, through the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. But we shared, to Dr. Richardson's point, share that information with almost allies, or trying to create allies for those that came into that sports space. They got to learn about the importance of. And I think even when we talk about the importance of Title IX, yes, we're emphasizing sports today, but as Dr. McDowell and Dr. Flowers pointed out last week with the Institute's Sport Conversations for Change, that's a broader platform of education. Title IX speaks to education and access. So again, we each have an opportunity to use our platforms. I think we each have an opportunity, even as I do in my classes right now, to build bridges to students and to faculty and to staff in our community to understand the history, as each one of my colleagues have pointed out, of the lived experiences of Black women in sport, of our contributions, of our excellence, but also of our challenges and still limitations and barriers that we face on a daily basis. As Dr. Richardson pointed out with the lawsuit that just happened, things are coming about. We may not hear that story more beyond this platform, but I hope that we continue to sort of engage and have a critical eye and utilize spaces of Black studies to sort of bring these narratives forward, to merge them into our daily content that we teach our students and the ways that we engage with others. The last thing I want to do is definitely thank our sister docs for being here, but to share the link that I dropped with you today to an Adobe, what's called a Spark page. And so I'm going to, hopefully everybody can see it, just share with you this resource page that we created just for this space to be able to speak to the efforts, the challenges, the history of Title IX at 50, and when we talk about equity for Black girls in sport. So I'm going to scroll through this relatively quickly, but I wanted to take a moment to highlight that you can find our contact information there, whether we're on Instagram or Twitter, LinkedIn, even our personal websites that we may have, our respective universities, and our academic fields that we currently teach out of. I'm going to say it that way. And where you can connect with us. The importance of Title IX of Education Amendments Act of 1972, some links that you can click on to be able to find more specific information through those particular efforts, and even stories. So the issues, challenges, and triumphs. Stories from the BBC, because yes, this is a diaspora. This is not, even though Title IX is a US-based initiative, the issue of Black girls and women in sport participation is actually a global issue as well. As we said, we're working on some new, many different platforms and different sport organizations to help sort of build content, knowledge, and bring those stories and have a seat at the table to ensure, like Dr. Flowers, that those stories get captured in reports and that the data is represented, as Dr. McDowell has talked about, to be able to disaggregate those particular figures so we know where we are and we talk about the state of Black women. We've got some stories on Black athlete activism that can be clicked on as well, and highlighting some of those individuals, such as Renee Powell in the space of golf, with a nice interview there that's clickable. A story of Wyoming Attias that came out last summer during the Olympics, along with her book and a video chat about her book, Tiger Bell. A Tucker Center for Research on Girls and Women in Sport that's at the University of Minnesota, which my colleagues and I also had an opportunity to have a panel discussion and talk about voices of resistance in athlete activism. And last and certainly not least, some resources and references. So I've got Dr. McDowell, you may not know this yet, but you're featured on a board talk with the Black Women's Sports Foundation. There's some links there on Black Women's Sports Foundation working with youth of all, the National Collegiate Athletic Association, National Women's Law Center, as was presented, and again, the Women's Sports Foundation. So as we talked about, feel free to see us and connect with us on at the NAS conference if you're interested, or reach out to us if you have any questions. We want to thank you for your time, for attending, and have a blessed weekend.